Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whatever the time is for you, we wish to extend a warm welcome as we embark upon the next hour together as part of our webinar series on communicating across cultures. My name is Angela Cunningham and I am Director of Products at Toastmasters International. And as you take your seats and settle in and get comfortable, I'll share just a few words on housekeeping. Please note that whilst you can see us, we cannot see you, but we do still want to hear from you. So we ask that if you have questions for our distinguished panel, simply submit them through the Q&A feature on your screen. We have set aside 15 minutes at the end where we will get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. This webinar is being recorded and access to this recording will be sent to the email you registered with in the next few days. The chat feature is open. Feel free to chat to each other during the webinar if you so wish. Please be sure to be courteous to fellow attendees. And now, let me introduce our moderator for today, Dilip Abhisakara. Hi, Dilip. Dilip grew up in Sri Lanka and moved to the United States for his higher education. After earning a PhD in chemistry, he worked for 12 years as an industrial scientist, during which time he joined Toastmasters and discovered he had a talent for public speaking and training. He was twice a finalist in the Toastmasters World Championship of Public Speaking Contest and has served as Toastmasters International President, the organization's highest leadership role. Along the way, he founded a speech coaching and training business that brought him in front of large international audiences. He also served as a college professor, teaching subjects related to communication and world religions. Encountering a call to ministry, he earned a Master of Divinity degree and now serves as a full-time pastor of a church in Pennsylvania. Thank you, Dilip, for being with us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Angela. I'm delighted to be here with our distinguished panel and the thousands of people who are watching worldwide. I'm very excited to introduce our panel. I'll start with Laila Kohistani. A native of Afghanistan, Laila has lived in the United States, Japan, and Italy. She is currently the Master Trainer and Director of Government Programs at the Cultural Intelligence Center in Michigan. She previously served 6 years as an active duty US naval officer. At the US Defense Intelligence Agency, she trained US and North Atlantic Treaty Organization military, law enforcement, and civilian personnel prior to their South Asia deployments. Additionally, she has served as cultural advisor to numerous national security and foreign policy leaders. She served a year-long deployment as the cultural advisor to the commanding general of the NATO Special Operations Command, headquartered in Kabul, Afghanistan. The second expert with us today is Delia Sheehan. Delia is an intercultural program consultant with 30 years experience and expertise in North and Latin American cultures. Fluent in Spanish and Portuguese, she is a dual citizen of the United States and Uruguay. She provides cross-cultural and language training to major companies like British Petroleum, General Electric, PepsiCo, and Caterpillar. She most recently worked for Carter's Corporation in Danbury, Connecticut, providing customer service and cross-cultural training services for corporate clients in North, Central, and South America, including Brazil. Our third panelist is Kristen Hamling. Kristen has worked as a psychologist for more than 15 years. Her experience includes serving for 10 years as a psychologist in the Australian Army Reserve. Kristen completed a doctorate in psychology, focusing on the well-being of first responders, police, fire, and paramedics. Kristen now contracts with a variety of organizations on matters related to trauma and well-being. She helped support a trauma response following the events of the Christchurch mosque attack and the Greg Mortimer ship during the COVID-19 lockdown. Kristen also operates a small private practice in New Zealand. Kristen moved to New Zealand from Sydney, Australia, 7 years ago. Since then, she has come to understand and value Aotearoa culture. That's a fancy word for New Zealand culture, I understand. And that informs the way she practices as a psychologist. Welcome, panelists. I am eager to get started. Shall we dive in? I am looking for Lila's picture. There we go. Let's make sure we understand the terms that we are going to be using in this discussion. As you know, it's focused on cultural awareness in business. So Lila, let me start off by asking you to describe what cross-cultural communication means to you and how your work and career fits into that.
I look at cross-cultural communication as the ability to communicate effectively across cultures. And by cultures, I don't just mean different nationalities. There are multiple cultures inside of any location, any geographic location. Inside of the US, we have multiple cultures. Inside of Australia, there are multiple cultures. Inside of any part of the world, there are multiple cultures. Even inside your organizations, there are multiple cultures. And so cross-cultural communication is about communicating effectively, making sure that your message resonates with your audience. And the way that I like to think about it the best is what I intended the way that it was perceived. And so for me, it's about making sure that what I wanted to communicate is what actually came across. And how that's really resonated with me personally in my work and in my career is, as someone who was born in Afghanistan and then immigrated to the US, but has also joined and served in the military and worked with multiple European partners over the years, I've had to learn to adapt quite a bit when it's come to communicating effectively with people across different cultures. And so that's driven me to find it in myself to work on these topics, not just personally and professionally, but to also make it my career. So I currently work for the Cultural Intelligence Center, as you mentioned, and we are a global consulting firm focused on specifically this, helping individuals and organizations be more effective working across cultures.
Wow, that is so impressive. Now, I want to ask the other panelists to consider this, and I'll direct this question to Delia. Lila just indicated the complexity of culture. It's not just simply where you're from, but there are many subcultural groups also. So why is this cross-cultural awareness, we are talking about business mainly today, but why is cross-cultural awareness so important, Delia, for business worldwide?
Well, thank you, Dilip. Thank you for having me, and welcome to Lila and Kristen and all my fellow Toastmasters and hopefully future Toastmaster members across the world. I wanted to talk a little bit about what talent acquisition is like today. You know, we have a very globalized economy, and companies are really looking for people that bring not just actual hard skills within their specific areas, be it IT, engineering, human resources. They're also looking for people that can work globally. If anything, this pandemic has shown us that working via internet globally is now really a critical skill to have. So what does it mean to have a global mindset? It means that you are self-aware enough to know where you are, where your perceptions are, your biases, unconscious or conscious are, what your blind spots are, and how that then translates and transitions into other cultures and settings. You know, we always like to think in the cross-cultural world that we begin with awareness of the self and understand what our perceptions of the world are so that we can build that bridge and begin to slowly fill in that gap of knowledge across to other cultures. And of course, it's extremely important because at any level, we are, in any business level, be it on the shop floor or in the C-suite, we're working with a very diverse and inclusive workforce. So all experiences are shared and valued.
Mm-hmm. Wow, Delia, you used a word that resonates with me. You used the word self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
We don't often think of that when we're talking about cross-cultural communication. But I saw Kristen nodding her head, she being a psychologist. I thought, wow, this is right up Kristen's alley. So let me move over to Kristen and ask you, Kristen, how does one develop self-awareness? We have many leaders in business who are utterly not self-aware, and we have many who are. What is the difference? How do we build that self-awareness so that we can relate better to people who are of cultures different from us?
I think when you're looking at self-awareness, or lots of different things, that if you have an underpinning value of truly wanting to understand and develop a different way of looking at a situation, a different way of understanding how other humans see the world. And as we've been talking about, this is cross-culturally, but it's also economically with people who have grown up in poverty or through trauma. It applies in so many different settings. And I think to have the self-awareness to know that your way of looking at the world isn't the only way of looking at the world. There's a thought. And as a psychologist, we have to be really aware of this. If I want to help someone, they're not going to listen to me. They're not going to appreciate what I have to say or lean into some of the discomfort that you sometimes have to in therapy, unless they truly believe that I want to understand their perspective. I want to understand their journey. I want to understand how they communicate, how they think, what their journey's been. And so self-awareness, I think, starts with that ability to know that there are multiple ways of looking at the world. There is multiple ways of coming to understand and coming to know. And a way of building trust, respect, mutual knowledge, shared understanding of things is to really appreciate other people's journeys and stepping into their world a little and to understand the way they look at the world, their paradigms. And it's a great way of building up that trust and respect with other people. And when you have that, that's when I think the magic happens, that they trust you, respect you, believe that you are a good person, wanting to understand and being curious about where they've come from and what they have to offer. And if you have those values of curiosity and wanting to learn, then it's a very good way of building up that rapport and trust and credibility with other people. And you can stuff things up, in all honesty. I say this in my training with people. If you're a good person and you really want to understand and you really want to do good, then ask the questions, and you can muck up a little bit, but people will correct you if you have taken that time.
I understand. I guess that muck up is a term you use. Americans might say mess up, right? But it's the same thing.
Okay. Yes.
We give ourselves some freedom. People are willing to forgive us for little mistakes we make when they know how interested we are in their well-being and in their performance. Right. So you're actually referring to another aspect of this cross-cultural communication, which is cultural intelligence. People are used to hearing about IQ, how smart people are, EQ, emotional quotient, emotional intelligence, but cultural intelligence. Lila, may I ask you, can you describe a little bit more what cultural intelligence means and how it is relevant in the business environment?
Absolutely. So we define cultural intelligence as the capability to work and relate effectively with people who are different from you. And again, those differences are not just necessarily about nationality or even visible differences, but it could also be about invisible differences, the differences in cultural values, the way that you approach problem solving and decision making. And so this is a field of study that, as you mentioned, is in line with the other types of intelligences that can be measured. And so cultural intelligence as a field has been around for several decades. And we do have an assessment that can actually measure someone's capability to work and relate effectively with those that are different from them. And so again, this research has been done over decades. But not just in the US, which we are very proud of. Our research encompasses over 170 different countries and people from all different sectors. So not just the corporate space, but also the education space, the military, the government space, again, across all of these different parts of the world. And when we started this research, it was initially started with colleagues in Singapore. And so we had a very diverse group of individuals. And we asked the question, the research question was, what separates those individuals that excel in a globalized world and those that fail? What is it that allows some people to do very well and where others seem to struggle? And so our model primarily focuses on what we call 4 different factors. Drive, which is your motivation to even want to work with people that are different than you. And then we get into knowledge, which is your actual understanding about how cultures may be similar or different. And then we talk about strategy, how important it is for you to actually plan to be around people that are different than you, rather than believing that it'll go well, it'll be fine, I'm a likable person, I can get along with anybody. And then finally, the last piece is the CQ action. So that is your actual ability to adapt in the moment when working with people who are different than you. And why we think it's so important for the business environment, Delia brilliantly touched on it earlier. There's a great deal of focus when it comes to talent acquisition, but we have been working with corporate entities around the world, not just on recruiting and hiring and promotion, but they've used our cultural intelligence assessments and our model to work on diversity and inclusion programs, to focus on leadership development programs, to talk about performance reviews, how to make sure that the way in which you're giving feedback is culturally appropriate for the individual that needs to hear it. We've seen corporations use it for team development, for global relocation programs. You want to make sure that the person that you're getting ready to spend potentially hundreds of thousands of US dollar, the equivalent of, to relocate them to a different part of the world, is going to be able to be adaptable when they get to that new part of the world. And so we're seeing corporations and people in the business sector looking at CQ as a hard skill, that this is something that is absolutely necessary for someone working in the 21st century, working in a globalized world.
Wow, this is fascinating information. Lila, I wasn't expecting to hear this, but I'm sure there are many people listening, among the thousands of people who are listening, Toastmasters and non-Toastmasters, many people in corporations. They might be interested in finding out how they can get a hold of this evaluation of cultural intelligence. Is there any place you can direct them to?
We have a phenomenal website. It is Cultural Q, Q for quotient, just like CQ. So culturalq.com. I would encourage you all to take a look at the website, and there are multiple ways in which you can access people on our team, and we are very responsive. So we would love to hear from you all and see if we can figure out ways to partner together.
Thank you, Lila. I'm definitely going to culturalq.com. You've helped everyone already. Now, you mentioned in your model, you talked about aspects that enable people to be successful. You mentioned drive, knowledge, strategy, and CQ. When I heard the word strategy, because I have been in corporations, worked in corporations for several years, I know strategy is a big word. And usually many of the business operations were driven by a strategy that the senior managers and the executives came up with for their corporation. But interestingly, management consultant Peter Drucker once said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. So obviously Peter Drucker thought that culture was extremely important. Why might he have said that? Let me ask Kristen if she has an insight into why that is so.
I do, and I think the best way that I can offer is one of my most recent experiences is watching New Zealand's response, the government response to COVID-19 and the pandemic. And having come from Australia 7 years ago, there are a lot of differences in this country. The differences between Australia and New Zealand may not be obvious. Well, it wasn't to me moving over 7 years ago, but there really are profound differences. And it makes me think, it's been making me think about the government's response to COVID here, how the strategy possibly wouldn't work in other countries, and it may not have even worked in Australia or certain states, Victoria, where I'm from. And to be curious about, well, why is that? And this is where Peter's words really ring true for me. And the New Zealand government, they didn't go in with a militant approach to the pandemic with physical distancing and the lockdown, but words like be kind to each other were used here. And so this approach of being kind, of looking after each other, not just yourself, but the vulnerable people of our society, or the first responders, or the doctors. And also we had the opportunity to send our children back to school, but we were asked if we please perhaps wouldn't send our kids back to school if at all possible, so that the schools could reopen for the frontline workers who could continue to work but know that their kids were safe. And so we complied. Very few people sent their kids back to school until the government said that it was okay. And my experience of New Zealand is that they seem to be quite an agreeable bunch. They complied and they didn't really protest too much. And I do think this is because of the culture here. Perhaps the way that we have had a bit of luck, I think, in terms of where we are in the world. But I definitely think this strategy of New Zealand government wouldn't have worked perhaps other places of the world. It's because of the culture that we have here of working together. And there's this beautiful saying in New Zealand called he waka eke noa, which is we're all in this together. We're all in the canoe rowing together. So what affects you is going to affect me. And if we can all row together in the same direction, we're going to nail this. We're going to achieve our goals a lot quicker than if we have one person rowing over there and someone trying to get back there. And I think this has come from New Zealand's a small country. We have a population here of about 4.8 million. And I came from Sydney. So Sydney, in the greater Sydney area, has 5.2 million people. So this country is really quite small, and we've had to be quite, I sense, interdependent. And they value community health, collective health, as much as individual health in this country. And it makes me think of the things that work here perhaps wouldn't work elsewhere. And I'll explain a little bit more later on with some of my discussions. But there's been a lot of research on cultural relativism. And I think it's helpful to understand that Ed Diner is a researcher who's been investigating this as a psychologist. And when I kind of give examples of this, I talk about what some people value in the world will be different to other places in the world, but the meaning behind why they value it can be quite different. So for example, in many Western places of the world, the example of self-reliance, let's say, is really valuable to people in America and Australia. And we value that because it's a mark of autonomy and maturity and having developed as a person. But if we go to Taiwanese people, they value self-reliance because it enables them to avoid being a burden on other people. So we have here the same sort of value of self-reliance, but depending on the culture, it's going to mean something quite different. And I think unless you understand this, you really are going to be hit and miss with your strategy unless you embed it within the culture. And Michael Moore in his movie, Where to Invade Next, was hysterical and brilliant at illustrating that some strategies and ideas for school lunches, for example, that work well in France, or drug legalization in South America, certain countries in South America, or prisoner reform, I think, in Norway, they work in those cultures. But to take that idea, the point he was making in the movie, and then apply it to America or other places in the world, it perhaps wouldn't work, because you have to get the culture right. So I think Peter Drucker really did get it right in my watching New Zealand with the New Zealand pandemic, that strategy really has to be enmeshed with the culture and context for it to work effectively.
Outstanding, Kristen. What great insights. But you've been talking about strategy, within a certain culture. Delia, I know that you have consulted with many different corporations where you're finding multiple cultures in the same space. There's a word called cultural dexterity, to be agile and not be stuck in only one way of thinking, one culture. Can you give some tips to our audience on how one can have cultural dexterity, which is so important in this world today?
Sure. Well, thank you. That's a great question, Deedip. In business, we sometimes have to get big ideas and put them into an actual implementable process. And so I've had the experience of dealing, like I said, with people from the shop floor, interns, short-term assignee expats, to VPs, presidents, and CEOs. And the number one, I would say, concern is, how do I implement this process that I'm being sent somewhere to implement? How do I gain trust and build a correct relationship so that the deliverables are there? Because as Lila mentioned, many companies will spend upwards of easily $750,000 to $1 million or more over the course of a 3 to 5 year international assignment. So it's really critical that these people hit the ground running, actually make the improvements and process changes that they're being sent to do, and meet those deliverables. So how does that happen? And of course, everybody always wants to know the 10 things not to do because they don't want to offend, but it goes a little deeper than that. And living in a foreign culture, there's a saying that says that living in a foreign culture is like playing a game you've never played before, and for which the rules really haven't been explained very well. So your challenge is to enjoy the game without missing too many plays, while learning the rules and developing skills as you go along. That sounds like a lot, but I know that Kristen did actually touch on, the aspect of being open. So one thing that I would say is be open and curious. Suspend judgment. Don't automatically think that something is happening, as Kristen said, the intention behind it, with your perspective, with your already conscious or unconscious bias. Set aside some time for interaction. I have always told my customers, have your door open. Be sure that you're going to lunch with people. Somebody invites you out to dinner or over a weekend to a park, say yes. Definitely you want to interact with people at their level and understand their social needs, because after all, they're wanting to interact with you. And also use basic language. Expect not to be fully understood. One of those classic examples is an executive that was being sent overseas and originally thought that he didn't really need to be culturally aware or have that, cultural IQ, if you will, because after all, he was very intelligent, and he let me know so. And so that was set up right there. He then called me about 4 or 6 months later saying there's something wrong. They're talking to me. And I somewhat understand them, but they don't understand me. And I know that they understand English. So use basic language. Something that we could say isn't so esoterical or verbose. If you're a Toastmaster, you know what I'm saying, right? And observe the surface of culture, but then look for nonverbal cues. Use silence, listen, wait, reflect on your expectations when meeting people from other cultures, and share your knowledge of specific cases. You can always say, well, we do this way, or I've seen you doing a process this other way. Explain to me how this works for you. And continue to learn about your own culture, because as the other two panelists have already mentioned, you really learn a lot when you look inwards, when you're introspective. You learn how you see the world. you begin to see that others might have different points of view.
Wow, what tremendous tips you've given us, Delia. Thank you. Thank you very much. But everything that Laila, Delia, and Kristen have been saying, I think our audience will understand how they're all interwoven. They're not discrete. They all have ramifications. And it's like the ripple that goes across a pond when one throws something into the pond. Delia, do you want to say something? Yes.
I wanted to just, yes, add one thing. Whenever an expat individual or family is traveling overseas or coming from overseas, the expectation is, oh, this is going to be great. This is going to be wonderful. I'm going to learn so much. I'm going to have so much fun. And at the beginning, it's that honeymoon. I only say this because having been 15 when my parents went on their second international assignment to a country they thought they knew the culture of, Brazil, right? The first month and a half was just fantastic. Everything was wonderful. And then, you know, just like a roller coaster, you're going up, 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 up in the excitement, and you start getting to the top, and you realize, wow, there's so much happening here that I'm not understanding, right, ladies? You know, you've spoken to clients about this. And all of a sudden, boom, you hit the proverbial wall. You're frustrated. You don't understand what's happening around you. As a matter of fact, you begin to second guess why you even made the decision to begin with. And if you have a family with a 15-year-old girl who is crying every day she comes home from school and you don't know what to do, certainly you begin to think that you've made a huge mistake. So understanding that you're going to have those feelings is very big. Having the understanding that you, your family, your spouse, your family that you left behind, wherever it is you were coming from, all those people are on this journey and this transition with you. And there are going to be some ups and downs. So in the end, you'll be glad you did it though.
Delia, your experience really speaks volumes to the principles you're talking about. Thank you so much. And I saw Laila nodding her head vigorously now. She has vast experience working with the armed forces in various cultural settings. Laila, I'd love to hear, I'm sure our audience would love to hear some of your stories that highlight what effective cross-cultural communication in business is like and what ineffective communication is like, and why the qualities that Delia was talking about are so important. And perhaps even you might have insights on how we can inculcate some of those.
Absolutely. Could not agree with Delia more. That's why you saw me vehemently shaking my head, is because we will hear from clients, again, across multiple sectors that will say to us, we have people that are really excited about going on a deployment or moving to a different part of the world, but that drive, that motivation tends to dwindle once things start getting a little difficult, right? They might have a view of what they are getting themselves into that could be romanticized potentially, because they really don't have the level of knowledge that they needed before they made that movement. And so what I have seen be successful in terms of how to prepare people, and the leaders and the employees that I have seen that have done well when working across culturally, especially in a more immersed environment where they are living now potentially in a different part of the world than they're used to, what I have seen be really successful is them taking the time to understand their own motivations. Why are they intrinsically motivated? What are the extrinsic motivations for them to do well in this assignment? And then also, how do we build their confidence? People will often say to us in our workshops and different clients that we work with, is to say, not everyone is going to feel confident. How do we help increase that confidence so that, as Kristen mentioned, they feel like it's okay if I muck up a little bit, right? That I still have enough self-efficacy that I will stay motivated. And then, of course, it's the actual hard understanding, the knowledge of what makes these cultures similar and different. You do need to know that. You do need to understand what makes you different from someone else, what your own cultural values are, potentially are really important so that you can understand how to adapt to other cultural values. Rather than saying, I'm just really frustrated that I have to work with this person, you can now understand, oh, it's not that I need to be frustrated, it's that I like to be direct in my communication, but they like to be indirect. So how can I adapt now to make sure that both of us understand each other? That way we don't have conflict when we're speaking with one another. And then, as you mentioned already, strategy being really important. Are you planning? Are you aware? Are you checking how an intercultural situation is going so that you can learn from it and do better next time? And then both of the other panelists mentioned briefly that it is also about how you behave and how you come across to others. And so for us, it's how do you adapt your verbal, your nonverbal, but then also making sure that, again, what you intended actually came across. And so that's what we have seen work, is people really using that mental model when they're interacting with others. And there is nothing that is better than actual contact with another culture. So reading books and potentially watching documentaries and movies, they can provide you some insight. And even using a cultural broker, someone who really understands the culture that may be from that culture, can be very helpful. But nothing replaces actually putting yourself in situations where you get to interact with someone and learning from those situations.
Absolutely.
So hopefully I answered the question.
Yes, you did. And thank you for those examples. Listening, among the thousands who are listening today are many, many Toastmasters. And many of those clubs are really intercultural melting pots. They're people from different backgrounds, different countries, different ethnicities. And we have the privilege in Toastmasters of learning to communicate, to send messages, to receive messages, and then figure out how we can do it better. So I'm particularly thinking of the part of a Toastmasters meeting, which is enacted in every business that has performance feedback. In Toastmasters, we call it evaluation. In business, it's called performance feedback or some term like that. So I'm addressing this to Kristen. How does culture modify the way you give feedback on performance? And how might that be different? Without using the terms, we talked about individualistic cultures and collective cultures. And those, one is very independent, the other one is very interdependent and cohesive in terms of groups. How does one give feedback on performance so that it can be received well?
And
Any cues?
And haven't we sort of been talking about that, is taking that time to learn, and if you have opportunities to go and meet with someone for lunch and to make that happen, I think coming to a multicultural country, certainly Australia and Sydney is, and New Zealand, is that there is plenty of opportunities to step into other people's culture. We have drummings through some people from Samoa in our community, and if you have those opportunities to go and experience those other cultures with an interest and a yearning to learn, I think that paves the way for you to be able to communicate more effectively around feedback, but also understand what do I value might be very different to what someone else values, and then the way that I communicate that. So when I'm thinking about giving feedback in Australia, they're quite brutal in actual fact. Sometimes when we give feedback, it's quite direct. And I was talking to my husband, who was a firefighter in Sydney, about this webinar coming up. And he said, gosh, well, I remember when a colleague failed his station officer exam, and he came back and the feedback was having a witch's hat strapped to his car. So, and his co-workers were saying, oh, you dunce, you failed the SO exam. Now, it was playful, and it did spur him on to try much harder in his exams in the future. But I just don't think that perhaps in other cultures that would go down very well. So know when you can be a bit playful or a bit more direct, or when that's actually just going to be offensive. And once people become defensive and feel offended, then you're really shutting everything down. You're shutting that openness, that curiosity, that creativity. You're really shutting it down when people get stressed. So definitely know your audience. I work with first responders and they are quite cheeky. And so knowing that how I give feedback to first responders and can be quite cheeky and a bit naughty in how I do that, I certainly wouldn't do that in a more corporate and a more serious culture. I would be seen as being really inappropriate and offensive almost. So, but if I wasn't like that with first responders, they wouldn't take me seriously and I wouldn't be able to build rapport with them. So you have to know your audience. So in terms of giving feedback too, I was thinking of a friend of mine who was doing some consulting work with PricewaterhouseCoopers in Boston. And this woman is quite amazing. She's kind and she's intelligent and very capable. And she was really horrified that some of the feedback coming back from a team meeting was that she was seen as very rude and very disrespectful. And she hadn't really understood, I don't think, that other cultures don't respond so well to this very direct feedback and quite assertive kind of feedback that we give in Australia. And she had to really build up her cultural quotient and cultural intelligence because it was really impacting on her career. So coming to New Zealand from Australia, I've had to learn how to be a little softer in my feedback, how to be involved in that feedback so that I align myself with the person rather than being direct and putting it onto them. It's like, what's my role? What has been my role here in this either not working or not working the way that I'd intended to? So I use a lot more positive affirmations, I think, here than in Australia. Our sandwich feedback has served me very well coming to New Zealand. And try to keep focus on what's going to be good for all. So really keeping focused on our team. Again, that saying, he waka eke noa. If we alienate somebody and we give feedback in a way that subjugates someone, then it's not good for the whole team. So we do it in a way that values us working together and it keeps us focused on the group and what we're trying to achieve rather than singling individuals out. I found that that's been more effective for me. And I think really valuing, again, what other people, their journey and what their values are. And so with that value of wanting to understand and learn and grow for each other, we I guess, open up those opportunities for better communication. And I've learned the hard way a few times, so.
Kristen, thanks so much. Very insightful advice. I wish we had more time, but we have only about 2 minutes before we move on to the Q&A that our audience has been sending, and Angela will be with us soon. So I'm going to ask Delia and Lila, who are going to receive the next 2 questions, to limit your answers to about a minute. All right. Delia, so the question here is, and I've seen this often, many companies try to incorporate cultural intelligence into their corporate mission statements, just to indicate where they are in their approach with their workforce and with their community. They have statements and values and slogans. Is this effective? Are there ways that they can improve the way they indicate that they are culturally sensitive and they want to be receptive to the cultures in their community? Since you work with so many corporations, can you give us some tips? And there are people listening today who might be in positions in their corporations to learn from you what you can say about how to show that the mission of your organization is also something that will uplift all.
That's a great question. And certainly I think that we've certainly have had great strides and achievement in terms of diversity and inclusion in many corporations. Diversity of all different backgrounds, genders, identifications. And we've actually had quite, I think, a hard time with inclusion. Many companies would always want to be able to check off that box and say, oh, I've done the diversity hire. I worked in a very big human resources department for a Fortune 100, and it was unfortunately sad to see that many times they were really just checking off the boxes. We've come a long way since then, and we understand that it's not just about having diversity, it's also about including that diversity in the overall makeup and operations and idea forming and strategies of the company. When we think of mission statements have to be concise, right, and short. Nobody wants to read a paragraph. We really sometimes have to distill to what diversity and inclusion really means. And it really comes down to valuing and understanding the shared experiences of us all. We really, regardless of whether you're a local or an expat or an immigrant or someone who, like me, is a third culture kid, you know, came from one place, parents from a different location, grew up in yet another country. We all have important experiences and insights that we can share. To know that that is valued is key. And I think that as companies really start to try and attract the best and the brightest from a global market and global talent pool, it's important to understand that if I go to that company, I will be valued. I will be valued for the experience that I bring as a mature worker, because no, I'm not a millennial, in case you haven't noticed. And I'll be valued for being a woman. I'll be valued for being Latina. I'll be valued for having lived and worked and gained experiences across the globe. That is what makes me who I am today. So the idea of valuing the individual and their experience, I think, is key. Rather than putting big words and jargon that, you know, we're tired of hearing and know that is rarely implemented.
Thank you, Delia. Angela, can you give us 1 minute for me to ask Laila a very important question?
Please, go ahead. Absolutely.
Because I come from Sri Lanka, which has a culture that looks at time very differently from the United States, I have run into this often, and I've had to actually change inside. Culture has an effect on the way we view time. And Laila, you bring an Afghanistani background into your US experience. Can you describe how time is viewed and how we can work at not making that an obstacle in our business communications and business work? How is time viewed in different cultures, and how does that affect our performance?
Absolutely. I will keep it brief as you requested. I think about short-term and long-term time orientation. So wanting to see something quickly, the results of something quickly being short-term, long-term, thinking about something more long-term. Also think about polychronic and monochronic cultures. So some cultures want to focus on one thing at a time, monochronic, and other cultures are okay with work and life being blended to an extent. So my humble piece of advice is understand the rhythm of life of the people that you are interacting with. So in the US, it's very normal to work until 5 or 5:30 and roll right into a social setting. You leave work and you go right into a social setting. In other parts of the world, when I lived in Italy, I spent a great deal of time in Spain, much of the Middle East, that is not okay. There has to be a separation between you leaving work, you need to reconnect with your family, people eat later in the evening. And so you understanding that is critical to you being able to build that rapport in a social setting. So I will leave it there and say that absolutely some of the cultural values that we've all heard of through people like Hofstede and Schwartz, these things are really important to understand about a culture, how they look at time.
Thank you, Laila. Angela, we are ready for you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry to have to kind of cut the flow. It was absolutely fascinating discussion, but we do have some great questions also from attendees today. I will start off with you, Dilip. There's a question here from Caitlin. Dilip, how do I develop an increased cultural awareness when traveling or working with customers and employees from diverse cultures? How do I develop an increased cultural awareness when traveling or working with customers and employees from diverse cultures?
And I've had to do that. When I was in the US in college, I was the first in my family to come to the US, and I had to work my way to pay for my tuition in college. And one of the things that I did was sell books door to door in small towns, working for a company, selling books. And you ask a fairly newly arrived immigrant to go around knocking on doors, offering to sell books. That's brutal. That's like being thrown into the deep end. Then you just simply ask for a swimming lesson. So I was in Kentucky and Tennessee. I've had amazing experiences. But what I found was, first of all, that you don't really have to read 100 books and become an expert on all cultures. It's a matter of your heart being open to people. And I found that really one of the great ways to really connect with people is to look at them with love. You might think, I thought this was a business discussion. It is. Love is business. Because when you're open to that which is best for your customers, best for your coworkers, best for those, then you are willing to subjugate your own desires to have it your way. And you ask, how can I best serve? And that's what gives you satisfaction, right? So I learned the art of listening. I remember one time I walked into a house I had previously visited, and they had, the wife had said she was very interested, but she needed a husband to give his okay. And I had been told, if they tell you to come back, don't go back, you're wasting your time. But she was so sincere. And I loved that. It was a beautiful family, 2 little kids. I just could not follow that directive. I went back that evening. And the husband, a big, gruff guy, said, come on in. I heard that you were coming. Sit down. He was giving me orders. He was, sit down, show me the books. And then while I was in the middle of my spiel, he grabbed the book from my hand. Now I would think that's rude, but now I know that's just his way. He's what is called a high D. Dominance was his style. He grabbed the book from my hand and said, let me see that for myself. He looked through it, flipped through the pages, asked his kids, do you think you would use this? He closed it, gave it back to me and said, okay, write up the order, we'll take it. But that was not in my sales spiel. And I had to quickly learn to adapt to that, right? So what you do is you are open, you're not bound by rigid rules. The only rule you have is this person I care for and I want to serve. That's the best that I can say right now, that it works. It works because people then give you that freedom to be yourself because you allow them to be themselves.
Philip, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Lila, I'll come to you next, if I may. We do have a question here from Coco. At the multicultural workplace, how do you deal with supervisors who perhaps think that their culture is more superior than those of staff who report into them?
So we offer a 360 version of our assessment. And I will say that that has proved to be extremely useful in helping to illuminate for people who are in leadership and management positions that perhaps the way that they are leading and managing is not resonating with the people who are their employees. And so I would say that one is about building self-awareness for that supervisor. And that's something that Kristen also talked about, is the importance of awareness. So you do have to understand how you are perceived. So that would be one piece, is actually testing the CQ of the supervisors as a data point. But then I would also offer up that for me, it's about talking to leaders about performance, about how important it is that they're creating a workplace where people can perform at their best. Because we know that disengagement in the workplace causes corporations billions of dollars every year. And so what I will say to supervisors and leaders who might not be moved by the empathetic reasoning that Dilip just provided, I'll start talking about hard numbers. That if you don't create this inclusive workplace, you're going to spend more money on recruiting, you're going to spend more money on retention because you're attriting too many people. And bottom line, you're going to have people that are disengaged in your workplace. And why would you want that? Why don't you want everybody to bring their best ideas so that your organization can be the most creative and most innovative? Because it is a competitive environment right now in a globalized world. You want to not only recruit, but also retain the best people. So for me, it's about knowing that there is an empathetic piece to this, but that also data can be really helpful and maybe what moves those supervisors and those leaders to take action.
That's very insightful, Lila. Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes. What I propose to do, panel, if it's okay with you, is pose one question. We'll start with Delia and then move around robin. But the question here comes from Debbie. For students who are graduating from high school or college, do you believe that they are prepared with CQ? And follow up, what should schools or educators do to help prepare them?
Oh, what a great question. Absolutely. In this time of budget cuts, not just here in the US, but worldwide in terms of education, there are a lot of things that our children, I know I raised 3 sons that went through the public school system. There are a lot of things that our children just are not getting beyond arts, gym. There are other subjects that would be wonderful for them and would help them have a more global perspective of what this world really is. And I think that certainly that would be invaluable, because when you open yourself up to the world, you open yourself up to so many opportunities that you may not even know that you were interested in. For example, when I was in high school, I actually studied pre-med, ended up graduating with a degree in architecture, but because I worked all those years as an English and Spanish and Portuguese teacher for large corporations and taught cross-cultural topics, I really fell in love with the cross-cultural field. So I really do feel that when young people are opened up to the world, be it through classes or experiences, or even spending a semester abroad, which is so wonderful for people to open up their perspectives, they have an appreciation of others, they have an appreciation of everything they have to offer to the world, and they really are better able to look beyond their own little bubble.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that. Kristen, I'm going to ask you the same question there for students who are graduating. Do you believe they're prepared with CQ, and what else can schools and educators do to prepare them?
I don't even know where to begin with this question, and I have 30 seconds probably to sum up. I don't think our kids are equipped in many ways for the 21st century and what's coming with technology, with the global world. We're still teaching, in my mind, too much in these STEM subjects, and it's not equipping people, it's young people, in my opinion, with anywhere near the tools that they need to be entrepreneurial, to build up relationships, which is what's going to be needed in the world ahead. We need a lot more creativity and innovation. And the way to make that happen is to build up the experiences that our children have. Certainly at my son's school, they have something called Discovery, which the headmaster is really trying to nurture experiences in all different ways, through arts, through literature, through different culture, through dance. She's nurturing that, but that's not a consistency, I think, a lot amongst lots of schools. Kids need a very different skill set coming into the world today, and if schools don't provide that, then as parents, part of us moving to New Zealand was to give our children a different exposure, different experiences, and to build up some resilience and to learn how to get along with different people. These are very important skills for our kids to have. So as the education system catches up, and it'll get there, as parents and then as older students, take that responsibility, please, upon yourself to build up these experiences yourself, because at the moment, as far as I see, no, I don't think every school is nailing it in this way.
Kristen, thank you. I appreciate your insights there. Panelist attendees, we are unfortunately at time. We could probably easily go another hour, but thank you so much, Dilip, Lila, Dilia, and Kristen for spending this time with us today. We truly appreciate all the wisdom, perception, and everything you brought into this discussion on cultural awareness. Thank you for joining us. We will be sending a recording soon to all our attendees. Please feel free to send the link to anyone you think who would benefit from the insights we all heard today. Until next time, thank you so much again for joining us, and goodbye.